In this video, I'm going to show you how to model a status panel, but really what we're going to do here is look at how we can change the description of an object in the middle of the game based on what's going on in the game. You don't really do this with rooms unless you've got secret walls or passages that have opened up, but objects might change description based on what's going on in the game. So what I'm going to do is model some sort of Star Trek-like thing here. And I'm going to have like a corridor in my spaceship. And what I'll do is I'll put a status panel here. And when we look at the status panel, it'll tell us what's going on with, I don't know, life support, weapons, and propulsion. So based on the status of weapons, life support, and propulsion, the panel is going to say something different. So how do I know what's going on with those three things? I'm going to need some variables. So let me add some variables here. I'm going to go to the variables tab and I'm going to make one called, life. I don't know, do I want to use Java or C support or syntax? I don't know, life support fixed. Or how about we call it life support status and we'll set it to 0. Life, let's live support, life support. Okay, and then let's make another one called weapons status. And then let's make another one called like engine status. And we've noticed we've defaulted them all to be 0. But now we have some variables that we can use in our game to determine what's going on, right? And maybe it's in this example, it's probably the player's job to fix all of this stuff. Like the player's going to go do some tasks in this game, and anytime they fix life support, weapons, or the engines, we're going to set those variables. We're going to change them from being 0 to being 1. So 0 will mean these things are off, 1 will mean these things are fixed or they're on. All right, so now if I run my game, right, and I type the word VARS, VARS, for variables, it's just a debugging command that I threw in the terminal. You can see we have weapon status 0, engine status 0, and life support status equals 0. So those variables are all there and they're all set to 0. So let me, in my corridor, let me add another object here. I'm going to call it status panel. And I'll say, I'm going to leave the description just kind of like blank, and you'll see why here in a second. It's not going to matter. And then I'll say there is, in the east bulkhead, or in the outer bulkhead, how about a large status panel is embedded in the outer bulkhead, whichever one that is. Bulkhead, right? Which is the wall of the space station. All right, and then let's put this in the corridor. So now, when I run my game, it says, aft corridor, this is a long north-south corridor, connecting the habitation module to the north with engineering to the south, to the extent that north and south make sense in space, which they don't. A large status panel is embedded in the outer bulkhead. Okay, so now if I type examine panel, as you notice, nothing unexpected, because that's our description of the panel. But what we're going to do is override that. So we're going to make a function here called examine panel, examine underscore panel. And the name is up to you, but it should be descriptive of what this function does. So we're going to make a function called examine panel. And we're going to call this function, or run this function, when the player types examine panel. So normally there is a built-in mechanism for examining things, but we're going to override that. We're going to make our own examine the panel function. So what I'll do here is now I'm going to check those three variables. Remember, I've got these three variables: life support status, weapons status, and engine status. Let's go back to our function, and what I'm going to do is print, well, how about this? PR, tab, print. The status panel shows, colon. All right, now what I'll do is I'm going to check the status of each variable, and based on whether the variable's a 1 or a 0, I'll print something different. If tab, hit the tab key twice. was it weapon status? I don't know, which one do we want to do first? Let's go look at our variables. Let's do life support status. If life support status is equal to 0, double equals, else, there we go. Print line, PR, tab. Life support. Oh, I don't know, how do I want to spell it? Life support. Offline, there we go. Otherwise, what's otherwise? I want to say life support is I don't know, active, enabled, functioning, functional. There we go. Functioning. How about functioning? Doesn't really matter. Okay. And now, just what I'll do is I'm going to make a sentence to call to or use this examine panel function. So I'll go to my sentences, and I'm going to find the verb examine or look at, and I'm going to select the panel. And when I examine the panel, when I type examine panel, I want to call the examine panel function instead. All right. So now what I've done is I've overridden the built-in mechanism for examining the panel. All right. Examine the panel. The panel shows life support offline. All right, cool. So instead of doing the built-in mechanism, giving us the default description, it's going to run our function, which prints out this. And then we can just copy this, right? And it was like life support, and then it was like engine status. Engines offline. Engines functional. All right, and now let's save that and run it. Examine the panel. The panel shows life support offline, engines offline. Okay, and now let's just do the same thing for weapons. Was it weapons status? Let's go look at our variables. It was weapons, yeah, plural, weapons status. Let's go back here. If weapons, then we'll say like, weapons offline, weapons functioning. All right, so now let's test that. Examine the panel. Okay, the panel shows life support offline, engines offline, and weapons offline. Why? Because it's checking those three variables. And if they're 0, it prints they're offline. If they're not 0, it prints that they're functioning. And just to show you that this works, I'm going to go to the game start function here. This runs before the first command is processed, and it gives you a chance to kind of customize the environment if you want to randomize the layout of things or set stuff up, or maybe even print out more of a backstory. You could use that. You could use this function for that. Let's say engine status equals 1. Weapons status equals 1. All right, so now when I run my game, type vars, you can see engine status and weapon status are 1 because we're setting them to 1 when our game starts up. But life support status, we left that at 0. Now, when I type examine the panel, you can see that life support's offline, but engines and weapons are online. So what we're doing there is customizing the description based on what's going on in in our game. And again, it's these variables here: engine status, life support status, weapon status. Those in this example would be changed when the player does some task to fix them, right? So maybe they fix a, they they replace a they replace a broken part. They push a button, they turn a switch, they put a fuel cylinder in something. They do something to change those variables, and then that status panel will reflect that change. So there's an example of a status panel. You could also use this kind of mechanism for, let's say you had like an iPad you were carrying around, and rather than having 3 variables, maybe you have 1 variable. Every time you complete a task, you add 1 to that variable. And when you look at the iPad, if like the value is, if your variable is 0, you print, okay, here's your objective. And when you complete that objective, you add 1 to it. And you say, okay, if the objective is 2, then print this. If the objective is 3, then print that. You know what? I might do that in a separate video. But you could do this. Imagine that this thing isn't a panel. Imagine it's something small you're carrying around, right? It's like your PDA or something, and you could have it print out what your objective is based on the status of the game. And then just one other kind of little thing here. Maybe you don't like the way this is written. A large status panel is embedded in the outer bulkhead. Watch this. What if I take the status panel and I take this initial description and I copy it and I put it into the aft corridor? Whoops, there we go. And I run this. Okay, so now you see this is a long north-south corridor with a large status panel. So we've mentioned in the room description that the status panel is there, but then we're still getting the status panel printed out. So let's make the status panel scenery in this case. So what it's saying is, so our room description says a large status panel is embedded in the outer bulkhead. Examine the panel. There we go. And it works there. It's just invisible, but the player knows it's there because we mentioned it in the room description. Also, we might want to do something like, let's add, maybe the player tries to read the panel. So instead of examining the panel, they try to read the panel. So let's say read the status panel. And we'll still call our examine panel function. We're mapping different combinations of input to the same function, right? So we'll say, read panel. There we go. Status panel shows the following. So there it is. There's how to create a function that will change the description of an object or customize the description of an object based on what's going on in your game. And how do you know what's going on in your game? Well, you have variables, and you, as the player accomplishes various tasks, you change them from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 or whatever, and then you can use that to customize how they're displayed to the user. All right, well, there you go. If you have any questions on how to get that working or any other text adventure stuff, just email me, message me. I'd be happy to help you.